I am thrilled to introduce Peter Ballerstedt. I hope many of you heard him speak this morning in the Forage program. He had his Forage hat on. He's got a different hat on tonight. He has a background in crop science and forage management. He received his bachelor's degree in agriculture and a master's in crop science, both from the University of Georgia. He received his PhD in forage management and utilization from the University of Kentucky. He has written numerous publications and articles, and he currently writes a blog focused on diet, health, and human nutrition called Grass-Based Health. Peter's area of expertise includes forage agronomy, grazing management, ruminant nutrition, human nutrition. He was a project manager for Hewlett-Packard for quite a while, a technical writer. He has an extensive background in forage production, utilization, and forage-based livestock production systems, and he was the forage extension specialist at Oregon State University from '86 until 1992. Prior to joining Barao, Peter was the Learning Products Project Manager at Hewlett-Packard. Say that 3 times fast. He worked for HP from '97 to 2011. He and his wife Nancy live in Oregon, and his interests include playing the hammered dulcimer, cooking, and caring for their 3 dogs. And he had a chance to have dinner last night. I took a shot to ask Peter to fly across the country and come here, and he said yes. And what a blessing that's been to us for both the Forage program and for what you will see tonight. So help me welcome Peter Ballerstedt. Thank you.
All right. Evening, everybody. Good evening. Did you have enough to eat? Good dessert? I hereby declare a guilt-free zone. Everybody say ribeye. Thank you. All right, now I have a record so I can tell people where I was and what I was doing. Are we good to go?
Almost. Come on now.
My name is Peter Ballerstedt. I am the Forage Product Manager at Barao. You think Learning Products Project Manager is tough. You try telling somebody over the phone that your name is Ballerstedt, you're from Barao. They just have a hard time dealing with that. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to talk to people who are producing a vital product to the health and welfare of not just the American public, but worldwide. Okay? I know things that I think the beef industry absolutely must know. So I'm just here to share it. And it's not my stuff. I didn't do the research, but I've read the research, and I'm happy to direct you to the same stuff I've read. And you can find me by just Googling Ballerstedt. There's not too many of us. You could throw grass-based health on that. That'll get you to the blog. If you want to write to me at Barao, all you have to do is take the P, stick it in front of Ballerstedt, put an @ sign and a BARUSA on the end, and voila. Scott could probably help if you didn't get that. Okay? So, what do you think of when I say healthy diet?
Fruits and vegetables.
Why do you think that?
That's what we want to say.
Okay.
Repeat that answer.
So the answer was fruits and vegetables, and the reason why is because that's what Weight Watchers says. Okay? So I would like us to start asking that question, why? Why do we think that? And then, are we justified in thinking that? Oh, please. There we go. Show of hands, please. This is the participatory part of the program. How many people recognize this device? Show of hands. Wow, low, low, low. This is Auto Lancet. This is for people who are diabetic, for them to get a blood sample to test for blood glucose levels. In 7 years, 2020. Half of all adult Americans are projected to be either diabetic or pre-diabetic. Now, there's lots of nonsense about sustainable agriculture. This is the unsustainable fact. We will never make a meaningful impact on healthcare in this country until we address this burgeoning epidemic of chronic disease. And I chose the word health food advisedly. America has a very strange relationship with health food. And it starts with two religious zealots back in the 1800s. And it's really difficult to understand just how profoundly these two gentlemen and their disciples have impacted the eating habits of a nation and consequently the agricultural systems of our nation. These two gentlemen happen to be vegetarians. And so a lot of the more bizarre notions that they came up with are with us today, including the eating disorder known as veganism. You go into a store and you start seeing these kinds of products. They're not real, but they're called health food. Why are they called health food? Texas barbecue primal meatless vegan jerky. Why? What if what we've been told is not only wrong, but harmful? And what if beef, of course Maryland grown, could be shown to be a part of the solution? And what if research had demonstrated this fact over 50 years ago? So, in the 2 hours that remain for tonight's presentation, I'd like to start to demonstrate the wide gap that exists between the scientific literature and the dietary advice. I'd like to explain why this matters to us, to our industry, to Maryland, our nation, and in fact, the world. But first, a quiz. So I hope everybody's paying attention. If I say cholesterol, do you think harmful or essential?
Essential.
Right. When you hear the phrase saturated fat, does the modifying phrase artery clogging come to mind? When you look at this wonder of nature, high quality animal protein and fat, gently caressed by heat from charcoal, made of nothing but grass, does the phrase heart attack on a plate come to mind? Okay, here's a test for you. Which mammals are designed to digest a low-fat diet? You're going to have two choices. Group A. Group A consists of sheep, of cattle, and the mountain gorilla. Group B consists of Homo sapiens, lions, and a polar bear, protecting its iceberg from disastrous anthropogenic global climate change. How many people think it's Group A? How many people think it's Group B? How many people are spending money to call in to vote undecided? It's a trick question. None of them are. There is a difference between digest and ingest. Clearly, Group A ingests a low-fat diet. A beef cow eating grass is ingesting a diet that's about, less than 5% crude fat. What's one of the principal products of rumen fermentation? volatile fatty acids, which the cow gratefully absorbs, so that by the time she gets done, 60-some% of her energy requirement comes from those volatile fatty acids. She's ingesting a low-fat diet. She digests a high-fat diet. Same with the sheep, of course. They're both pregastric fermenters. The gorilla does it with an enlarged cecum and colon. It's a post-gastric fermenter. We don't have either of those structures. And neither do these carnivores. We must have those fats in our diet. And there's a whole lot you can talk about here, but mankind is a meat-eating cook. The evidence is clear. In America, we no longer fear God or the communists, but we fear fat. I love that quote. We've been trained well. You may not be aware of it, but in January of 2011, the 2010 Dietary Guidelines got released. Every 5 years they crank one of these out, have since the early 80s. All federal policies are affected by this virtually. Anything involving food is affected by this. School lunch programs are affected by this. Aid to the elderly is affected by this. It's huge, it's massive. And in these, we are told to restrict our intake of total fat to less than 30% of calories. We're told to restrict our intake of saturated fat to less than 7% of calories. We are told to restrict our intake of cholesterol to less than 300 milligrams per day. That's less than you get from 2 large eggs. Told to increase our intake of carbohydrates to more than 60% of our calories. They promote the use of low-fat milk and lean meat and meat substitutes in school lunch programs. How's that feel? All this is consistent with the official dietary policy that began in 1977 with a governance committee. One thing you got to know is that policy does not equal science. The two are completely opposite. Science, if it's functioning, is constantly testing itself. It's constantly forming hypotheses, doing tests, evaluating the data and saying, is that hypothesis still true, or have we found contradictory evidence? If we found contradictory evidence, we need to reform a hypothesis and test it again. Policy, once set, has an immense amount of inertia to it. It resists change. Anything that smacks of change, the institutional antibodies will attack it. So don't for a moment believe that the dietary guidelines of the United States of America are based on science. Then, in 1977, it was said, it has been impossible to demonstrate that within our population, those who have heart attacks eat different foods from those who do not. Didn't matter. They knew what they wanted to write, so they wrote it. And today, no difference. There's no clear effect of any dietary fat intervention compared to usual or controlled diet on total mortality, cardiovascular mortality, myocardial infarction, stroke, cancer, diabetes. I know how to read. In the dietary guidelines themselves, they say, the food patterns recommended in the dietary guidelines have not been specifically tested for health benefits. Really? Really? And yet, those are the guidelines that are suggesting a diet for every American over the age of 2, including pregnant and lactating women. I love this quote. We've all been unwitting subjects in a long observational study, the hypothesis of which is that a low-fat, high-carb diet will reduce obesity, diabetes, and the other so-called diseases of civilization. In my view, it hasn't worked out all that well. Marvelous understatement. This is a point to keep in mind for the rest of the evening and going forward. If you're going to have a low-fat diet, it is by definition a high-carbohydrate diet. Because protein stays about the same, it's all got to sum to 100. So if you pull down the fat, you are by definition raising the carbohydrate. Okay? So the recommendation is it's a high-carb diet. Thank you for participating. But what's happened to the incidence of chronic disease since the introduction of these guidelines that are not science-based or supported? Well, the age-adjusted prevalence of coronary heart disease, heart failure, stroke, cancer, diabetes, overweight, and obesity have all increased. That's age-adjusted. Now, we as forage agronomists are familiar with the concept of unintended consequences. So we will be somewhat sympathetic to someone who started off with good intentions. But at some point, you just have to evaluate the data and say, whoops, made a mistake, now we need to change. There's no evidence of that. Those guidelines that were released in January of 2011 are in place for the next 5 years. They have no intention of changing. Now remember, they're saying 60% of our calories ought to be coming from carbohydrates. So let's look at what the list of essential nutrients are for the human being. Let's look at the, water, energy, minerals, amino acids, fatty acids, vitamins. These are the essential nutrients. These are the nutrients we must have in our diets because our bodies cannot manufacture them. And there's a couple others that may be questionable, so we'll throw them on the list. Oh, by the way, you're starting to see citations at the bottom. I have a list of citations. I'm happy to share them because, again, don't take my word for it. Go read it if you'd like, and we want to advance the information. You notice that there was something lacking on that list? No carbohydrate on that list. Per these authorities, there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate in the human diet. Yet 60% of our calories are supposed to be coming from them. Why? Well, because we know that fat is bad. If you hear someone tell you that you must have X amount of carbohydrate in your diet, what they are confusing is the need by the body and ignoring the fact that there's such a thing as endogenous production versus exogenous supply. You don't have to eat carbohydrates. Your body can make what it needs. So here's the example. The lower limit of dietary carbohydrate compatible with life appears to be 0, provided that adequate amounts of protein and fat are consumed. That ought to be of interest to you. The minimal amount of exogenous and endogenous carbohydrate is dependent upon the brain, so it's about 100 to 140 grams of glucose per day. After keto adaptation, 80% of the central nervous system's energy can be derived from ketones, leaving 20 to 28 grams of glucose per day. Endogenous glucose production rate, 2 to 2.5 milligrams per kilogram per minute. That's 2.8 to 3.6 grams per kilogram per day. So for a 70-kilogram man, that represents 210 to 270 grams per day. That's well in excess of what the need is. You can make all the carbohydrate you need, provided you're eating enough protein and fat. Witness the Plains North Americans, the Inuit of the Arctic North, the Maasai of Africa, the Aboriginals from the Australian outback. Start looking at the science here. Dietary cholesterol has no meaningful effect on total cholesterol level. Let me repeat that, just in case you thought I misspoke. Dietary cholesterol has no meaningful effect on the total cholesterol level in your blood. This isn't recent science. This is 1937, and that's never been refuted. That is not controversial. So why are they telling us to limit to 300? That's a really good question. Low-density lipoprotein cholesterol is at best a marginal risk factor for coronary heart disease. So anytime you go to your doctor and they start talking to you about your LDL cholesterol number, it's not a meaningful indicator of cardiovascular disease risk. In fact, higher total cholesterol is associated with greater longevity for women and seniors. Sisters, if you're on a cholesterol-lowering medication, I beg of you to please read the literature. And I'm not talking about the handout that the doctor gives you. Brothers, if you haven't had a heart attack and your doctor's got you on a cholesterol-lowering medication, I beg of you to read the literature. Lower total cholesterol is in fact associated with a greater cancer mortality. And they've seen this in every study they've ever run. So you want to talk about the spiritual darkness of the billions of dollars spent every year to lower cholesterol below 200. Please, I'm begging you, you need to know this. Saturated fat does not cause heart disease. Anyone who tells you it does is either knowingly lying to you or they're sincerely wrong. It's just a simple fact. Saturated fat and total fat consumption, in fact, is positively associated with longevity. It's a strange world I live in. I know this stuff and I walk around and I read things, and it's just amazing. A low-fat diet will increase your risk of cardiovascular disease. Any of this of interest to the livestock industry? Any of this of interest to you?
Yes.
A high-fat diet produces greater weight loss, better blood glucose control, and reduced cardiovascular disease risks. So what's the heart-healthy part of this meal? Yeah, go for that. Go for that. It would be even better with butter on it. So we've been taught that animal fat and saturated fat are almost synonymous terms, right? But that's not true. Any animal fat is going to be a mixture of fatty acids. In the case of beef tallow, 50% of it approximately is saturated. So excuse me while I get out the notes because I want to make sure I get this right. One-third of that saturated fatty acid, though, is stearic fatty acid. And stearic fatty acid is metabolized by the body into oleic fatty acid. Oleic fatty acid is the principal fatty acid in what? Olive oil. Remember the Mediterranean diet? Yeah. 42% of that fat in beef tallow is monounsaturated already. 90% of that is oleic acid. Again, we're back to the olive oil and the Mediterranean diet. 4% is polyunsaturated. 58% of the fat in beef tallow will improve your LDL So we'll just read it. 58% of the fat in beef tallow will improve your LDL to HDL cholesterol ratio. The remaining 42% will raise your LDL cholesterol, but it will also raise your HDL cholesterol, therefore having an insignificant effect on the total cholesterol to HDL cholesterol ratio. And those two ratios are far better indicators of risk. Eating beef tallow would improve your blood lipid profile so long as carbohydrate is restricted. And lard would be even better. This is news to you. You may or may not be comforted by the fact that our physicians are not terribly well, in general, informed about this information. A survey was conducted in 2003 and asked the physicians these questions, several questions. 93% of them did not know that a low-fat diet, in general, would increase blood triglycerides. Fact. 75% did not know that a low-fat, therefore high-carbohydrate diet would decrease HDL cholesterol. 50% thought that a low-fat diet would not change HDL cholesterol, the so-called good cholesterol. But one thing you ought to get straight again is that the cholesterol that's in HDL is the same cholesterol that's in LDL. It's the lipoprotein molecule that's containing the cholesterol. Cholesterol is not good or bad. It's good. 50% did not know that carbohydrate was the diet component most likely to raise triglycerides. Raising triglycerides, lowering HDL cholesterol are both understood to be significant increases for heart disease risk. A low-fat, therefore high-carbohydrate diet will significantly increase your risk of heart disease. You may have heard the term diseases of civilization, Western diseases. Going back over 100 years, we've had medical missionaries and doctors going out and serving remote populations throughout the world. And if they got there while those people were still eating their traditional diets, regardless of what those diets were, they were uniformly struck by the virtual absence of several chronic diseases that these physicians had been well taught to recognize back in Europe and North America. Many of these missionaries or physicians were still with those populations when those populations underwent what's called a diet transition. Following that dietary transition, all of those diseases started to show up. And the transition was always the introduction of refined sugar and refined white flour. Because they're cheap, they don't spoil, they're easy to transport. They're the perfect trade item. Okay? Today, there's emerging consensus about a phenomenon called metabolic syndrome. There are a cluster of diseases that if you have one of them, you are at increased chance of having some of the others on the list. Diseases like insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, atherosclerosis, hypertension, stroke, cancer, asthma, sleep apnea, osteoarthritis, neurodegeneration, now including Alzheimer's disease, gallbladder disease. This is just one person's list. These are clusters of metabolic diseases. They all lead to premature death. Conventional wisdom says that obesity is the cause of these diseases. So we are encouraged to avoid obesity to lower our risk of contracting these other diseases. But in fact, the science is saying that obesity itself is a metabolic disease. Obesity is what? It's a disorder of excess fat accumulation. And fat tissue is extraordinarily regulated tissue. It's metabolically active. It's a metabolic disease. So you can find papers like this, which then say carbohydrate restriction improves the features of metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome, in fact, may be defined by the response to carbohydrate restriction. If you have some condition, you put the patient on a restricted carbohydrate diet, that condition gets better, maybe that's part of metabolic syndrome too. And it gets even more exciting because having diabetes, having obesity, increases your risk of cancer significantly. And now people are sussing out what that link is. And there's some very exciting stuff coming. So much so that it's probably time for us to get away from the idea that toxins in the environment are what cause cancer. More likely what we're looking at is chronically elevated levels of insulin and insulin-like growth factor play a role in cancer proliferation. But we can get into that. So again, the science, the actual science. Dietary fat, whether saturated or not, does not cause heart disease. Carbohydrates do, because of their effect on the hormone insulin. Refined carbohydrates, starches, and sugars are the most likely dietary causes of cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and the other common chronic diseases of modern times. No meaningful association exists between meat consumption and cancer. So why does this matter to us? This is my moment of clarity. Well, it's one of my moments of clarity. There are a whole bunch, but the one I'm going to talk about in public here is this one, Christmas 2007. You set the camera up on the tripod, you get it all composed, then you hit the timer and you run, you get in the shot, and then you look at the shot in the camera and you wonder what's wrong with the camera. I mean, clearly it's broken. It's distorting me. By the way, here's a trick. Learn this too. If you want to, take your picture when you put it in a PowerPoint presentation, stretch it 10% vertically. Leave it horizontal. Not that I would ever do this. No. So by this point, my wife, Nancy, had been on her own journey for somewhere around 5 years. She'd been reading, she'd been trying her own application, but she was smart enough to know that talking to me about it before I was ready to listen to her talk to me about it probably wouldn't work real well. No identification? Wow. Any case, so when I was finally ready, I had an in-house expert, which was really handy. She directed me to books and blogs and all kinds of information. I began my own journey, and then 3 years later, Christmas, I'd achieved a 50-pound weight loss without exercise, completely dietary, no drugs, eating 3 times the red meat daily that the government says I should for my health. In 2007, I was manifesting many symptoms of prediabetes. By 2010, normalized blood sugar, normalized blood lipids, blood pressure fine, feeling great, thank you very much. By eating your product 3 times a day. Is that of interest to you? If you find that this describes you or someone you love, an abdominal obesity, a waist circumference of above 40 inches for men or over 35 inches for women, serum triglycerides 150 or above, HDL cholesterol 40 milligrams per deciliter or lower in men and 50 or lower in women, blood pressure of 135 over 85 or more, fasting blood glucose of at 110, some say 100. If you have 3 of those 5, by their definition, you have metabolic syndrome. But I'm here to tell you that if you have any one of those, eating your product 3 times a day and restricting carbohydrate is the best means of treating it. What could it mean to our industry? If the public understood that this is health food, you know how we are about health food. It's no longer a commodity, it's health food. And then if it's diet food, cha-ching. We really need to get a re-examination of what we consider health food in this country. And if it comes down to a contest between T-bone and tofu, what do you think wins? The The only reason for consuming tofu is because you believe you should. Nobody does it for the taste. And the more you learn about that, the more you know that you just shouldn't eat it at all. Animal products from forage. I mean, even 85% of the feed units that go into feeding the nation's cow herd are forage. So we're already grass-based. What would be the effect if we got people to truly understand that this is heart healthy? That meat is medicine. Wheat is murder. Meat is medicine. Today in Maryland, your adults, 64.4% are overweight or obese. 28.3% are obese. That ranks you 22nd out of the state. Higher is not better. 9.4% have diabetes. That ranks you 29th. 31.3% have hypertension. That ranks you 21st. Children 10 to 17-year-olds, 28.8% are obese or overweight. That ranks you 36th, sorry. And by 2030, jumping ahead. So the future for children who have obese parents, even if they're normal weight, and especially if they're obese. You start 1 to 2-year-olds with no obese parents, they have an 8% risk of becoming obese at their 20s. Normal weight 6-year-olds, no obese parents, 10%. Obese 6-year-olds have a 50% chance of being obese when they reach their 20s. And obese 10 to 14-year-olds with obese parents, 79%. You want to talk about sustainability? We can't sustain this. This is the tidal wave that's coming at us, and you're producing the product that ought to be in the school lunch programs instead of the meat substitutes. Obesity rate is projected to reach 58.8 by 2030. In Maryland, over the next 20 years, obesity could contribute to, and then these are the numbers of additional cases because of that increase. All these diseases being associated with obesity. Obesity-related healthcare costs in the state could climb by 21.3%, which could be the 7th highest increase in the country. I know our budgets are flush. We've got lots of money that we can invest in things like this. We're talking about human lives here. And you're producing the product that could be the solution. And if you yourself are facing this, I'd like to encourage you to try a different way, because I know lots of people who found success. And if you're producing the product, and you can have success in your own life, and then you go to your customers, and you can tell them from your own testimony, and then they can try your product, then they can have the success. Now you got a customer. Now they go tell people. It becomes a, you should pardon the expression, grassroots movement. So conclusions. The current policy is not science-based. It is deeply flawed, and it is plausibly responsible for the current chronic disease epidemic and the one that's coming at us, like a train wreck. The existing data shows that beef, of course it's got to be Maryland grown, could be part of the solution. And more research needs to be done, of course. But when we've got people who are trusting that the lie that fat in the diet causes heart disease, and then doing research based on that lie, we've got to get past all that. In my morning talk, I talked about the Liebig's barrel, that analogy, where you have a rain barrel, old-fashioned wooden barrel made up of staves of different length, and the shortest stave is going to set how much water you can hold in that barrel. Well, let's think about the effective volume of that barrel being the health of someone. And the shortest stave represents the greatest insult to their health. So if I take the typical American eating the standard American diet, which is made into an acronym SAD, so they're eating sad, and all I do for them is exchange whatever beef they're currently eating for grass-fed / organic / natural / whatever, what reasonable expectation should I have that I will see any meaningful effect on their health? And my review of the literature says none, because it's not the limiting stave. If, on the other hand, I take that typical American eating the sad diet and exchange a significant number of their calories for calories coming from animal products, regardless of how they're produced, I have abundant research evidence to expect to see a profound impact on their health. Somewhere down the road, something else will become limiting, some other factor will come into play, and we can look at that, but we're nowhere near having established that yet, and I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. I like this radical modernite. Oh, it's not radical, it's Hippocrates, and it's not so modern. But you can only do this if you currently understand what your food ought to be. So what's next? Become educated. If I can help you in that process, I'm happy to do it. At the last AFGC conference, I was able to organize a panel where I used that slide of, what do you know, you're just a forage agronomist? I said, all right, because I talked to him the year before about it. And this year I said, all right, this year I brought you a registered dietitian and a pediatric endocrinologist who treats childhood obesity with a restricted carbohydrate diet. He lives over in West Virginia. I know people. If you want to have this as part, let's talk. Let's figure out how to become better educated about this. If necessary, become experienced yourself. You know, a lot of, I shared this earlier, I'd rather watch a sermon than listen to one. Show me it. And then we can talk. Begin to challenge the narrative if you feel called to do that. If you find people in your public schools teaching the nonsense about diet, nutrition, human health, start asking to see the primary research that supports that position. Primary research, not some policy paper. And it'll be a chance to educate that person, and maybe you can help them along. And again, I'm happy to help with that too. Find your own position of influence. I'm looking for that person who knows the right people, who can get into the policy organs of government and start kicking desks. I'm looking for the right person who has enough political connections to start having people ask very uncomfortable questions towards researchers who've been accepting government money and fudging the data. And that's not putting it too mildly. It is actually. There's malfeasance been going on for decades. It needs to be challenged. It needs to be brought out into the light. I'm looking, and I sometimes think that I'm looking for that person who has just buried a spouse as a result of one of these chronic illnesses. And they could well plausibly be the result of